What's up, everybody? This is Joe Capsule Flores here, and I'm going to be doing a slight review and initial impressions on the PowerA wired Fightpad for the PS4. There's also a Nintendo Switch and I believe an Xbox One version as well. They're a little bit different from each other, but very much the same as well. But here's the box. Here's the back of the box. Just gives you kind of like an overview of what to expect. One thing before we move on, this controller has a braided cable, which is detachable. We'll get a little bit more into that, but it is 9.8 feet long, so that's kind of cool. I like wired controllers a lot, just because I don't have to deal with recharging or replacing the batteries or anything like that. For any like wireless controllers these days, people like their wireless controllers, but I prefer wired ones because just for the fact that I don't have to mess around with any of that. But I'm just gonna open this up to show you what's inside. There's a little instruction manual in here, nothing too crazy. But what I did find very cool about this controller is that it has different face plates. And on the bottom of the face plates, there are some magnets that'll fit nicely into the controller. It comes with a blue one. It comes with a white one, as you can see here. And then it also comes with a black one, as you can see that I have on the controller itself right now. So the reason why I bought this controller to begin with was because I have a Sega Saturn, a modded Sega Saturn, and I also have a modded Neo Geo MVS. It's a custom MVS, and I needed some way of playing games without having to invest in any OEM original controllers, because those are, not only are they rare, but they're expensive, and once they break, finding parts to fix them or replace them are kind of hard. So I was looking for options for using other controllers to play on Sega Saturn and Neo Geo specifically. And also Dreamcast as well, because I do not like the Dreamcast controller. So I was looking for other methods of doing that. But I came across, and these are friends of mine, good friends of mine. They work at Brook. They make these awesome converters for modern controllers to be used on retro consoles. So they recently, maybe a couple years back, released this Brook Wingman SD. And the SD stands for Saturn Dreamcast, because it works for both. Dreamcast on the left, Saturn on the right. And what you can do is plug in a modern PS3 or PS4 controller into this, and it'll convert it and make it usable on your Dreamcast or your Sega Saturn. So I said, cool. That would be a very cool method of playing games with modern controllers and not having to worry about spending crazy amounts of money on OEM controllers, trying to find them in good condition, and then also having to worry about like breaking them and using them and diminishing them even more, and then having to find more, which will be really, really expensive and really hard. So initially I was using this Hori mini pad, specifically for Dreamcast, because it has the analog sticks on it. And yeah, it worked out pretty good. Not a big fan of the D-pad though, but it was okay. Buttons are a little stiff. Buttons up here are okay. Nothing to write home about. Spongy a little bit. But I did not like the D-pad. And using this controller specifically for Neo Geo and Sega Saturn, not so much for Dreamcast, but for Sega Saturn and Neo Geo, I didn't like the D-pad. It's not very responsive. It's a bit stiff. And I found that playing fighting games specifically were pretty bad on this controller. And not only that, it was pretty small too. So I was using it for a while, but I decided to look elsewhere. And I came across the controller that is the topic of this video. This is the wired Fightpad by PowerA. Now, the reason why this caught my attention because it immediately looks exactly like a Sega Saturn controller. And you can see they obviously took the design of that and they just kept going with it and continued to design. The thing that's different with this controller compared to the Sega Saturn controller is it has L1 and R1 bumpers on the top, and then it also has a pair of triggers. Now the triggers, they're not analog. Okay, they're digital triggers, and they feel very, very similar to Nintendo Switch Pro controllers triggers. So if you're familiar with that, that's what these triggers feel like, and they feel amazing. Okay, so that's the only real differences in terms of like the button layout, other than obviously the home being right here and the start button, aka the options buttons being right here, and then there's obviously the share button here. But yeah, so here's the DP, LS, RS functionality for the D-pad here, depending on if you want to use the digital or the analog pad or the sticks for control. But yeah, it works pretty good from when I was testing it. But we'll go into a little bit more specific details because a lot of people were asking me, like, you know, how does it feel compared to like other controllers? So, I mean, obviously, if you're going to be playing Sega Saturn with this controller, you're going to compare it immediately to the OEM Sega Saturn controller. Now, this is the revised controller in America and the original controller in Japan. But as you can tell, the D-pad is extremely similar. You could tell that they just pretty much copy and paste the design of that for this controller here, this new one. And the button layout is the same. Now, that's the one thing that I was very particular about when looking for a replacement controller for Sega Saturn, or I should say an alternative one, was I wanted the 6-button face layout, and this one had it. And then, of course, I also needed the L and R buttons up top, and this one had it as well with a little extra. But yeah, that's why I initially went with this controller, because the button layout was the same. So in comparing these two, to get down to the comparison, okay, the first thing that you're going to notice is that the buttons on this controller, the PowerA controller, are definitely more stiff when pressed. There's a bit more tension there. You can obviously feel it when you do the pressing. So if you're going to be playing like a button mashing game, or you need to press a lot of buttons really fast, like fighting games, you need to move from button to button really quick, you're going to feel like that might be a major difference between this and the original Sega Saturn controller, where the Sega Saturn controller, the buttons are definitely not as, I should say, stiff or tight feeling. There's not that much tension from neutral to full press. But at the same time, these buttons, I've always felt like they felt a little cheap. They feel a little like third-party plasticky cheap. And when I put hands on this controller, I don't get that same feeling. I actually get a feeling of maybe some kind of quality button press, you know? So it seems like, you know, this one might have been the first party controller, if you were to think about that specifically. But in terms of the D-pad, they pretty much feel the same without, you know, trying any games right off the bat. This one definitely feels more new, as this one's obviously older and more broken in. Same thing for these buttons here. And then the start button, okay, is pretty much this button right here. Now this feels pretty much the same in terms of tension. But obviously, like I said, the quality of the button itself being pressed has always felt a little bit more cheap to me on this controller. Same thing for the L and R buttons too. Never really liked these L and R buttons in particular. but this feels a lot better. It feels more solid. It's more stiff, obviously, but it just feels like a more quality press. In comparison to the L and R bumpers on the new controller compared to their OEM one, they do feel a little bit different, but I do like and prefer the feel of these triggers more than the OEM one. This one feels a little bit mushy to me. It's obviously clicky if you're familiar with that, but it just feels a little bit mushy. Whereas this one, it feels more clicky, but it's not a mushy feeling at all. And I don't know how to explain it, but if you've ever played on an Xbox One or Xbox Series X controller, the D-pad has that clicky feeling to it. It's not a membrane. Then yeah, that's what those buttons feel like up here. And then these obviously have a membrane button that makes it feel kind of mushy, but not in a bad way. This actually feels really nice. I really like how this feels, like I said, similar to the Switch Pro controller. So yeah, that's my first initial impression, and the difference between the two controllers without trying any games out is that the first thing is going to be the buttons feel more stiff, but everything else feels better in my opinion, including the grip of the controller, where the OEM one is kind of thin. This one actually is more chunkier, more thick, and has more rounded grip on the bottom to fit comfortably in your hand, in the palm of your hand, as to where the original OEM one is like really flat. So, I mean, that might be preference, who knows? I don't know if people are very particular about that, but this definitely feels more comfortable to hold in the hand, for sure, hands down. Okay, so another thing that I was going to talk about was the comparison of this controller and the 3D pad, which is another OEM Sega Saturn pad. And there's one area where the original 3D pad shines more than this controller, okay? Now, D-pad feels great, as everyone knows. Feels pretty much the same here. Obviously, no analog on the new controller, but that's not what I was going for anyway. The triggers, if you play games that aren't really using them as analog triggers, then that doesn't matter. So, using them for digital presses is not going to be the greatest on the 3D pad as to this newer one where these are digital presses and buttons, and they feel much better. But the buttons, the face buttons, the A, B, C, X, Y, Z buttons feel absolutely amazing on the original 3D pad. They just feel so great. They feel way better than the OEM original buttons on the Sega Saturn pad. In terms of the Japanese and the revised version for America, where these feel a little kind of janky, kind of like cheapy feeling, right? But these buttons feel absolutely amazing. They feel great. They're not too stiff, but they're definitely stiffer than the original pad, and they don't feel cheap. So it feels amazing. That's one thing that I wanted the most out of a controller that I was going to be using on Sega Saturn to replace these OEM ones, or as alternatives for these OEM ones, was the quality of the buttons and the layout. Now, these are definitely more stiff than that 3D pad, so I do like the buttons more on the 3D pad than the buttons on here, just because of the way they feel on the 3D pad just feels better than this. But I do like the way that these buttons feel more than the original Sega Saturn pad. So, that's my my opinion and my initial review of the feel of those buttons specifically, because that's going to be kind of like the first thing that you notice the most. But if you're familiar with the Hori mini pad, then these buttons definitely feel kind of similar to that, although they do have a bit more tension and more stiff compared to the mini pad. So just to give you a heads up if you're trying to decide if you want to buy this controller or not. Okay, now if you want to use this controller on Sega Saturn, okay, now this is a USB controller. It's made for PS4. Obviously, you see the PlayStation buttons here, and then you see the R1 and R2 buttons here. Obviously, there's, L2 and L1, R2, and R1 up here. It's made for PS4. It's made for, they're calling it the Fightpad, so it's made for fighting games, I would assume. But if you want to use this on a Sega Saturn, you're going to have to use that device that I told you about earlier, the Brook Wingman SD. Now, this works in converting PlayStation 3 and 4 controllers to be used on Dreamcast or Sega Saturn. So what you're going to do is plug in the end of the PowerA controller into the converter. That's pretty much it. You're good to go, and you just plug it into the Sega Saturn. Now, the thing that I'm going to say that is the most important part of using this as a Sega Saturn controller is that these buttons will not be mapped correctly unless you change that on the Brook Wingman SD. Now, Brook Wingman SD has a lot of features in it, okay? It has turbo functionality. It also has button remapping, which is the most important thing in my opinion. So you're going to need to do that when using this controller as a Sega Saturn pad. You're going to need to change this to A, B, C, X, Y, Z. And now, in the beginning, when you first get this controller by default, it's not going to be like that. This is going to be A and B, this is going to be X and Y, but this will not be C and this will not be Z. You're going to need to change that. Now, after you change the button maps in the Brookman, in the Wingman, the Wingman SD, it feels absolutely amazing. You could change this to C, and you could change this to Z, and then you could also change this to L and R up here too. But the most important thing about doing that is, I don't know if you can see this. I'm gonna try and get it as best as I can on camera here. But right here, there's a switch on the top of this controller, okay? I'm gonna try and get the zoom to look at it. It's kind of rough. But right here's a switch, okay? Now that switch basically changes what these triggers and bumpers are up here. Now, when you first get it, it'll be on the left as a default. And basically, this is going to be L1, R1, L2, R2. So if you're trying to remap buttons with that switched over to the left as it comes as default, you're going to have a problem because R1 and R2 right here are going to be R1 and R2 here. So if you change these if you change this to C and you change this to Z, you're basically changing these buttons too, and then you're not going to have a true R button here, okay? As well as you're not going to have a true L button here, just because, actually you probably could just map these two to like L and R right here, but it's not going to feel right when you're playing certain games using this as L and R instead of L and R right here. So a really neat feature of this controller is you can switch what these top buttons actually function as. And if you switch it to the right, it changes this button right here to L3, which is left trigger pressed, and R3, which is left analog pressed and right analog pressed. So if you press down on the analogs, if you're familiar with PS3 and PS4, Xbox controllers, you know that if you press down on the analogs, there's an additional button there. It'll change these to those buttons. And then it'll also change these R buttons to L buttons instead. And then because of that, you're able to map C and Z to their own functionalities for true Sega Saturn layout, A, B, C, X, Y, Z. And since these are R's and then these are analogs and these are lefts, you can actually map those to be true L and R buttons and still have the C and the Z right here. And that's how you're going to be able to use the Sega Saturn, this controller on Sega Saturn using the Brook Wingman SD. Now, if you don't do that, the controller is not going to feel like an OEM Sega Saturn controller. And I was a bit concerned about that until I actually learned about this switch up here on this controller. And that was a game changer. That changed everything. Now, because of that, I can actually use this as a true alternative for Sega Saturn. And that is absolutely amazing. So I'm going to switch over to some gameplay and show you what it feels like and what it looks like as I'm performing moves in like fighting games like Street Fighter and such. So yeah, stay tuned for that. All right, so there it was, the PowerA Fusion wired Fightpad for the PS4, comboed with the Brook Wingman SD for use on the Sega Saturn. Again, you could use it on the Dreamcast, I guess, if you wanted to. But yeah, I was able to pull off the moves really easy. Had no problem using D-pad. D-pad feels really good compared to like the OEM Sega Saturn D-pad. It feels like pretty much like the same exact thing. The buttons, if you're using this controller for fighting games, you might feel like the buttons are more stiff than the OEM Sega Saturn controller, and more stiff than the 3D pad as well. But no, they're not too bad. I've definitely felt a lot worse controller buttons than this. I do prefer the buttons more on the 3D pad, but I do prefer the buttons more on this Fusion wired Fightpad than the OEM ones, where the buttons feel a little bit cheap and janky to me. So, and as well as the trigger, LNR triggers as well. I do prefer the feel of both the L1 and R1 triggers, as well as the ones down here, the L2 and the R2 ones as well. They feel better on this controller, and the D-pad feels just spot on with the the OEM one. But in my opinion, I think that this is better, just maybe because it's brand new and the other one's like old, and already broken into. But yeah, this feels great. Didn't have any problem pulling off any moves, didn't have any problem pulling off any combos. Nothing really too big. I mean, I am a professional Street Fighter player and a fighting game player, so I do use Fight Stick over controllers anyway. So I was having a little bit problem with that because I'm not a pad player, I'm a stick player. But that being said, I was able to pull off some of the harder, more difficult combos that I normally would be able to do on a pad that were more comfortable on an arcade stick. And I was doing like pretty good. I did Sakura's crouching short, stand short into fierce DP, which was really cool in alpha. And then I also pulled off, Sabretooth and Ken's combos in X-Men vs. Street Fighter. So I didn't really have too much of a problem. If you're a pad player and you like fighting games, you're pretty much gonna love this controller. And if you're just looking for another controller to use with your Sega Saturn that's similar to the OEM one, I'm pretty sure you're gonna like this controller too, even for a casual gamer. So, yeah, I highly recommend the PowerA Fusion wired Fightpad for a Sega Saturn alternative controller. And yeah, you're gonna need to get a Brook Wingman SD too to make sure that that's all works, and you're gonna need to remap the buttons as well. So there's instructions on how to do that on Brook's website for the Wingman SD. Just follow those instructions, and you're gonna have to find out like which buttons are which buttons. I remember, I think this was mapped to L as a default, and then this was mapped to like R as a default. So once you understand like where the buttons are mapped to the controller like as a default, and then you use the Brook Wingman to remap those to where you want them to be, you're gonna have absolutely no problem with that whatsoever. And it saves to the Wingman as well. So you only have to do that one time and then you're good to go. That's the amazing thing about the Brook Wingman SD. But yeah, I hope you liked my small review. I should say small. This is like what, a half an hour video, but it's just like a really cool comparison between some of the other controllers and a review of this one right here. So if you have any other questions, just feel free to just drop me a post in the comments, and I'll try my best to answer them as much as possible for you.